Evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from Vienna, Jerusalem, Boston, Amherst, and many other places. It's a very great pleasure for me to host the first presentation of this freshly published volume on the Arab and Jewish questions, Geographies of Engagements in Palestine and Beyond. I am extremely grateful to the Central European University, and in particular to the Department of History and the two professors, Nadia Al-Baghdadi, who is professor of history at Central European University, which is now since some time located in Vienna, partly still in Budapest, but mainly in Vienna, and Professor Aziz Al-Azmeh, who is also a professor emeritus of the Central European University. And I'm grateful to the rector, Michael Ignatieff, who accepted to be our cooperation partner of tonight's conversation. I am, of course, very, very happy with our two editors, Leila Farsak and Bashir Bashir, who succeeded to have this wonderful volume published at the most prestigious Columbia University Press, which is a really great honor for all of us. And I'm grateful to Alan Confina, who joins us from Massachusetts University in Amherst, who will contribute to the conversation tonight. I just wanted to add that this book brings together leading scholars from all over the place. In all, it were more than 150 Arab and Jewish scholars who gathered in Vienna at the Bruno Kreisky Forum in the last 10 years for this engagement, for these Arab-Jewish engagements, which the Kreisky Forum had the pleasure to host, and which we are very, very sad to having it only on digital format tonight. We would love to have it physically. Hopefully the next Arab-Jewish engagements, which we plan together with Bashir, who's directing the initiative since almost 10 years. I hope we will be able in after the summer, inshallah, to host the next physical meeting of Arab Jewish engagements. I would like to not eating up more of the time that is very precious for the debate on this volume, and I would like to hand over to Nadia, who is accepted to be the moderator of tonight. And I thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, and hope to see you soon in Vienna.
Okay, thank you very much, Gertraud, for providing the space, and of course to the Bruno Kreisky Forum for making possible not only the publication of such a very special book, but also to be really a forum for discussion and to allow this book to find another life after being published, namely in form of debates as the one I expect you will be having today. It's my pleasure to moderate the discussion on this book. Allow me to show this briefly because it's also a very aesthetically pleasing book, I shall say. Arab and Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagement of Palestine and Beyond. And as the title is suggested, and Gertraud already said that it found a wonderful publisher, it is a book that is going to mark indeed for some years to come the discussions, and will be, as it has been already very much acclaimed internationally, a book that will provoke discussions in the positive sense. It is opening new directions and new perspectives. And all of this, I should use my position here as moderator, of course, is only possible because there are places like the Kreisky Forum that provide space for free and secure discussion, and also for discussions that go beyond the stances of statements that were very often finds it is really an engagement that goes across boundaries, real and imaginary ones. This book launch, let me say so, could not have come at a more poignant time today, as many of you may have followed on other channels. If you are not tuned into this one, we remember not only the desire for, but also the possibility of change. We celebrate or commemorate, it is difficult to say, and especially in the presence of specialists of the politics of memory here with us. We remember today the 25th of January, which marks, along with some other dates in the more recent past, the 10th anniversary of the Arab Rebellion as we call it, which saw, after the events in Tunisia and the overthrow of Ben Ali from power, by the day today, 10 years ago, Egyptians turning to the streets, witnessing 18 days later the resignation of Hosni Mubarak. 10 years later, there remains the bitter realization how moments and opportunities of change did not yield the promise invested into them. On the contrary, what went wrong? Tonight, this is not the panel that wants and will discuss these questions, but maybe not at first glance. If we look at what the book opens up, and this is one of the many ways in which we can turn to the book at hand for tonight, it also connects us to discussions that we are having just now about this memory. For this book, let me show this just again, this book aims in the first place at posing the right questions. What went wrong? Posing questions and at reopening lingering questions that are still unanswered. The first one, as is stated right in the beginning of the book, the question of Palestine has not yet been answered, and takes from there the strength to go into different directions with an admirable boldness to merge lines of thought and political stances that recognize precisely in the entanglement of European, Middle Eastern, and US history, not an obstacle, but rather a means of and for the understanding of the unsolved questions of Israel and Palestine, of the Arab Muslim question, and of the Jewish question. This is, at least in my view, one of the incredible strengths of this book, and this is where I think it will contribute to a large discussion that is will take place among specialists in these fields touched upon, but also far beyond. The present volume then brings together eminent international scholars who seek to uncover across disciplines and across perspectives coming from literary studies to political studies to historical inquiries, not entangled histories, as they are pointing out, but also, and maybe even more important, entangled future of the Arab and the Jews, or the Arab and the Jewish question. And this is very rare for a volume to achieve such a perspective, that it indeed brings to the forefront both by discussing the immediate past, also perspectives into the future. Let me then introduce the panelists of tonight. We have the privilege to have, as the General Secretary of Kreisky Forum already mentioned, we have the privilege to have the two editors of the volume with us, Professor Bashir Bashir and Leila Farsakh, and two distinguished scholars, Professor Alon Confino, who joins us also from the US, from the University of Massachusetts, and Professor Aziz El-Azmi, who tunes in from Vienna, from CEU, Central European University. None of them really require or need any introduction. They are distinguished experts, all four of them, in their respective fields and far beyond. Allow me therefore to be really rather brief for the sake of having more time for discussion. Professor Leila Farsakh is professor for political science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. and is a specialist in political economy of the Arab-Israeli conflict, labor migration, Middle East politics, and the political economy of the Middle East at large. Of her many publications that she has under her name, I shall only mention the following, because they shed light on the way she looks at these issues and which tend to be oftentimes forgotten, namely the Palestinian labor migration to Israel, Labor, Land and Occupation, published by Routledge in 2005 and 2012. She is the editor of Commemorating the Nakba, Evoking the Nakba, which was a special volume with the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies in 2008, and numerous other articles and publications I shall not mention. But I shall mention that she has worked also with a number of international organizations, including the OECD in Paris. And since 2008, she has been Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University in the West Bank. The co-editor, her partner in this project, is Professor Bashir Bashir, who is Associate Professor of Political Theory at the Open University of Israel and Senior Research Fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. His research interests include democratic theory, citizenship and nationalism studies, liberalism, historical injustice and reconciliation, memory of the Holocaust and the Nakba, and political thought at large in view of Palestinian nationalism. His writings have appeared in many languages: English, Hebrew, Arabic, Italian, and German. And again, I single out among his publications only two here. He co-edited The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history, which appeared with Columbia UP in 2018, and an early book, The Politics of Reconciliation in Multicultural Societies in 2008. Our two distinguished commentators, again, very briefly, Professor Alon Confino is director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies and professor of history and Judaic studies at the University of Massachusetts. His research focuses on the theory and practice of history writing with a special focus on topics of memory, culture, and nationhood. Of his publication, let me mention the following, which I think is pertinent for our discussion: the very much discussed and more recent A World Without Jews, the Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide, which was published with Yale UP in 2014, and a book that I found interesting, The Nation as a Local Metaphor, Württemberg, Imperial Germany and National Memory, 1871 to 1918, which is a more early writing. The second commentator of this evening is Professor Aziz El-Azmi, who is university professor and distinguished visiting professor at the Central European University here now in Vienna, former Budapest. He specializes as well in late antique Islam as well as in modern political thought. And I shall stay very brief here again with his many publications, but shall mention the very recent translation into English from Arabic of a seminal book in Arabic, Secularism in the Arab World, which was just now published by Edinburgh University Press. He has as well served on international boards, the Advisory Council of the UNDP Arab Human Development Report, and other such international formats, and is at present co-directing the international research project Striking from the Margins, State, Religion and Reconstitution in the Arab World. I shall close here. I could speak forever on all the four speakers with what they've done, but you will hear them in real speaking about the book and to the book. In terms of procedure, I shall first give the floor to the two editors to briefly frame the book and the formation of the book. They will outline the genesis of the volume, and then I'll pass the word to the two commentators, first to Alon and then to Aziz, who have prepared some reflections and comments on the book. I shall give again the word then to the two editors to respond to the praise or maybe critical remarks to the book as such, and then we'll open to the floor, to the audience for questions and answers. Please, as you are listening, you may already come up with some questions. Please write your questions into the chat. For the sake of time and moderating the question and answers, we'll collect all your questions that you have in the chat, and then we'll bring them forward to the floor. So herewith, I would like to pass to the editors. I don't know, Bashir or Leila, who goes first?
Okay, I'll start and then let Bashir go ahead. First of all, thank you very much, Nadia, for this very flattering introduction about the book. You really captured this essence of what we are trying to do. What I would like to do really is just two things. First of all, I'd like just to acknowledge the importance of the Kreisky Forum for this project. Without it, we would not have had this book. As you explained, the genesis really of this book started with the idea of a realization that we did want to put the Arab and Jewish questions in conversation with one another. These questions have often been debated, but they have been not put together. People thought of the Jewish question as a question of what are the rights of the Jews and how Zionism tried to address it by negating the Palestinians, but it didn't go beyond that. And the Arab question has often been about the right of Palestinians as a result of what Zionism did to them, but rarely have we explored the Arab question in a larger way with a critique of nationalism and how it twisted what is the Arab question. So the aim was to put these two questions in conversation with another and really try to do three things in particular. One is to explore the historical connections between the Arab and Jewish questions and how they are tied fundamentally to Europe and the failure of Europe to deal with the non-Christian and its reliance on colonialism to try to address this problem, or rather to shovel it away without ever resolving it. So, and that what led us in a way to see that there is a deep connection between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and how the Arab question and Jewish question are tied to a common history that needs to be further disentangled and explored. Secondly, we wanted to explore the political connections between these two issues, between the issues of Palestinian rights, Arab rights, what are Arab rights, and Jewish rights, and how they are shaped by a political ideology at the time, which is nationalism, which we're still struggling with, and which, as you nicely and beautifully pointed out today, as we celebrate, or we commemorate, celebrate would be wonderful, but commemorate 10 years on the Arab Uprising, an uprising that precisely tried to reivindicate the right of citizens, irrespective of their ethnicity, religion, or identity, to have rights, to have the state protect their rights. And with the authoritarian states now is violating again. But it does not, it still doesn't, it shovels it under the carpet, but does not resolve the question of rights and all individuals in the Arab world, what rights they have and they want to reclaim. And thirdly, we also wanted to envisage and explore how putting these two questions together allows us, as you nicely put it, to think of the future, not just to remain stuck in the past or stuck in the present, but actually connect the past, the present, to think a future in critical ways. It's not that we're providing a solution, but trying to see what are the elements that need to be addressed in thinking of a solution to this problem of the Arab and Jewish questions. One which directed us in the direction that we need to transcend nationalism, but also we need to reconnect again Europe and the Arab and Jewish questions, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And that, again, would not have been possible without the Kreisky Forum, without the generosity, without having hosted us in these workshops where we had a secure environment to talk about some challenging ideas and to discover together how the connections and the intricacies, and also to imagine a better future. I'll stop at that. And again, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Bashir, do you want to come in or you leave it here?
I would leave it here in terms of substance, but I would nevertheless still owe a very big thank you to everyone, and definitely to Gertrude and to the Kreisky Forum, where I have to say that my intellectual journey would have been completely different without the basically hospitality of the Kreisky Forum since I was basically in high school. So this is really a very emotional and meaningful moment for me. Gertrude has been remarkably supportive. We are very grateful. This enterprise definitely cannot be reduced to only those who are appearing in their contribution in this volume. This is a joint collective effort of dozens of people, including leading intellectuals who are not with us today and who are not included in the book. And I'm very grateful to all of these people. Just one thing for me, again, this project is part and parcel of a larger project where the Kreisky Forum is definitely deeply involved in it. And this larger project had 3 pillars. The first pillar is called Alternatives to Partition, which is a book that was also published at the Kreisky Forum, which was hosted by the Kreisky Forum, which basically challenges and questions the whole paradigm of partition, whether it is the way forward dealing with the question of Israel-Palestine, but also beyond. The second project is also a project that is not directly related to the Kreisky Forum, but definitely to the crowd that is influenced heavily by the conversation at the Kreisky Forum, which is basically the book of the Holocaust and the Nakba, which you, Nadia, mentioned and was published by Columbia University Press with the partnership with my dear and very good friend and colleague, Amos Goldberg, who I actually owe him a great deal of enrichment when it comes to intellectual engagement. And lastly is basically the book that is at our hand today, which is basically the Arab and the Jewish question and their interlink. The bottom line, this enterprise is about bringing together and in conversation questions that otherwise look segregated, separated, and unrelated. So the purpose is really to provoke this conversation and to think about productive, not only to think, but to reveal, to uncover histories of joint struggle, which are struggles, histories, memories that otherwise are looked, separated and segregated, where the purpose from my perspective at the meta perspective of intellectual engagement has 2 folds. And by this I finish. One is this, I see these types of projects put together as an invitation and a very clear call to interrogate modernity, definitely in its constitutive components of nationalism, nation state, and its drive to homogeneity and purity. And in addition to that, definitely colonialism. This is one cluster of it. The other cluster, which is related to Israel-Palestine, how all of these questions put together and enterprises put together lead to us to the ethics of binationalism, which is premised basically on decolonizing the question of Palestine and dismantling any form and all forms of Jewish privilege and supremacy in the way of achieving basically Jewish-Arab partnership premised on egalitarianism and form of historical reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bashir. And I think it's really worthwhile to make that point that as much as we as scholars like to write books and do things intellectually, bring to paper, discuss, it is absolutely crucial. And we see this not only in the COVID situation, how much we depend on fora in which the exchange of ideas is creating new ideas. So there is something to the solitude of sitting at your desk and work, but what also we see very clearly in products as yours, that it does require a frame in which you can develop new ideas across lines of disciplines and others. So I think this is very well taken to make that emphasis. Before I give the word to Alain to provide his first commentary, let me also say, although I'm seeing that the chat is already being used, while you are listening now to comments, this is to the audience, please feel free to already pose your questions in the chat. They will not go lost, but we keep record on this and then we'll address them after the first round of discussion. Alain, I don't see you now on my screen, but I know that you are still there. If you would take the floor, please.
I am here. Can you see me? Thank you, Nadia, and my deep gratitude to the Kreisky Forum, to Gertrude, to Laila and Bashir for generously inviting me to take part in this conversation. As I'm the first speaker, I'd like to begin with a brief overview of the book for the benefit of our audience. The topic of this edited collection, the Jewish and the Arab questions, is original and important. What have been the relations among the Jewish question the Arab-Muslim question and the Palestine-Israel question. The Jewish question, born in Europe, concerned with defining the political rights of Jews in Europe, and with Europeans pondering how to solve the problem of the existence of Jews in their midst. Zionism embarked on exclusionary national building project, migrated the Jewish question to the Middle East and to Palestine particularly. The Arab question concerned with the existence and resistance of the indigenous Arab population in Palestine to the Zionist project, and the various Zionist and Palestinian reactions to this question, and also with the question of Arab nationalism and how it dealt with cosmopolitanism and diversity. The question of Palestine concerns the still ongoing search for a just solution in Palestine and Israel. Each question separately has been well known and written about, but the juxtaposition among these questions has not been researched. Some projects are illuminating precisely because they take known subjects conceived of separately and put them in relations, thus asking new questions and able to open new avenues of research and thought. This is precisely the case of this book. The book has 10 essays divided into 3 parts: Interrogating Europe, Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Colonialism, Beyond the Binary Division Between Jews and Arabs, Revisiting National Constructs, and Stubborn Realities and Alternative Visions for Palestine-Israel. These 3 questions, the book argues, are not only entangled, but also belong to the same history, one that continues to foment tensions in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. They draw on multiple disciplines, and they bring together and challenge dominant understanding of nationalism, citizenship, and decolonization. It historicizes what now seem for many natural. As I read through the book, it was my sense that an underlying theme among these 10 essays, of course, we cannot talk about all these 10 essays. We are trying to find common denominators among them. It was my sense that an underlying theme of the book is about silencing and the recovery of the past. For, indeed, as Nadia put it very well, for new thinking about the future. Not about solutions, but new thinking. The book challenges us to think beyond attempts to silence the vicissitudes of people's lives in the past. Let me give some notable examples. The volume explores the place of the Arab Jew, that is Jewish Arabs, those Jews who lived in Arab countries. It explores the place of the Arab Jew within Zionism, colonialism, and the Middle East. And it asks, how and why did the terms Arab and Jew split, rendering them mutually exclusive, an ontological oxymoron, when in the past they belonged together very well. At the same time, the book also explores how the othering of Jews in Europe proceeded via othering of Muslims, and how after 1945, the new term Judeo-Christian civilization, which was coined only after 1945, after the Holocaust, produced a split between the Jewish and the Arab/Muslim questions in Europe. So it tries to link anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, not only in the present, but also in the past, in the way that Europeans looked at Jews 100 and more years ago. So splitting Arabs and Jews in Zionism and delinking the Jewish and Arab Muslim questions in Europe have now become common ways to think of the 3 questions for a lot of people. And this book put this in question. Further, emblematic of healing the wounds of the past between Europe and the Jews, Europe supported Israel and fought anti-Semitism. This is well known. But the book also shows how this picture is often based on the absence of a third party that complicates the narrative and is therefore silenced, the Palestinians. They are a problem because they exist. In this analysis, we have beyond the Jewish and the Arab questions, also a current European problem that needs to be addressed. All these ways of thinking have a history. And in illuminating this history of these three questions, the book explores possible productive relationship between the Arab and the Jewish questions and possible new ways of thinking about the future. My view is that this book will become the first port of call to scholars interested in the link between these three questions and also about European colonialism, Jewish and Arab nationalisms, and Israel-Palestine. I'd like to raise briefly 3 points for discussion. These are not so much questions, but I want to hear what Bashir and Laila have to say about them. The book, I think, opens up brilliantly conversation on the meaning of Palestinian and Jewish rights to self-determination in the 21st century and how to reconcile them. It challenges Zionist denial of Palestinian rights, and it also opens the question of Jewish rights. That is, what are the rights of the settler? What are the rights the native should or may or ought to give the settler? They write, the editors, for Zionism, while remaining a settler colonial project, has also created a vibrant Israeli culture and political community. This is a reality that both Palestinian and Arab nationalism need to contend with, end of quote. In what way the book, I'd like to ask Bashir and Laila, in what way the book, focusing on the Jewish and Arab questions, chart new ways of thinking about Zionism, settler colonialism, and Palestinian and Jewish rights to self-determination? If we want to go beyond the current situation. The second point is the two important ideas and practices that are challenged by the book are Europe's intellectual hegemony and silencing, and the ways in which Arab nationalism and Arab states have denied or undermined the diversity of the Arab world and its cosmopolitan legacy. I was wondering, what do you see as the link between the two, if any? Or are these two different things? And finally, when I look at your overall work, Laila and Bashir, I see how this book belongs within your larger intellectual pursuits about alternative to partition, as Bashir said, rethinking statehood and Palestinian nationalism, as Laila mentioned, binationalism and the Holocaust and the Nakba. So I wanted to ask you, what are the alternatives the book charts given these intellectual journeys, and actually how, if you can tell us a little bit more, because I find it very, very interesting, how this book fits within your intellectual journeys and in what way it fits also with your current and future works. Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure, an intellectual treat to read this book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for both the very, very suitable and cohesive summary you provided of the volume, and also for the pertinent questions. I need to ask Laila and Bashir to hold back for a moment to answer the questions, but would give first the floor to the second commentator, to Aziz Al-Azmi, to come in and share his comments with us, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. My thanks once again, like the thanks of all the others, to the Kreisky Forum. They have been at the forefront of the matter that engages us now, as Kreisky himself had been at the forefront in his own time. And may I just also mention my very dear departed friend, Yehuda Elkanah, in this particular connection, because this is a matter which had engaged us both in many, many conversations over very many years. And I do like actually to mention him and to remember him, and I remember him very fondly. If I may just add a few footnotes to what has been said by Alon and by Nadia and by the editors before. Let me start by saying that this is truly a most engaging and thoughtful collection of reflections and studies. And I really do congratulate the editors for putting this together. And of course, I do realize that this was the result of a much, much longer process than simply editing this particular book. On reading some of these reflections and studies, one might be left with a sense of foreboding sometimes, for the book emerge in a context of stubborn realities. And the term stubborn realities actually is the title of the book's third section. Stubborn realities, increasingly stubborn as time passes, as I see it. One might also be left with a sense of forlorn melancholy, as one reads Avery and Cohen's contribution on native Palestinian and other Arab Jews in Palestine prior to 1948. One is divided between hope and despair, as the mediating element, politics, seems really to be absent from the discussions. Having said this, let me go to the stubborn realities. The first stubborn reality that I see is an Israeli body politic that has veered irrevocably to the hard and extreme right. One reads with profit and pleasure Penzler's contribution, which propounds a thoughtful and self-reflective, but not self-critical Zionism. One is reminded that Zionism is a broad church, a capacious sentiment, as he calls it, which can accommodate a range of approaches to Palestine. One would wish, speaking of stubborn realities, that one might reflect upon the preponderance of the expansionist and recalcitrant wing of Zionism, and consider the internal economy that orders and articulates Zionism's various forms today and determines the constellation's political effect. One might also reflect upon what in the online universe might be described as a virtual Zionism, unrelated to what Penzler refers to as indigenized colons in historical Palestine, a boundlessly viral Zionism speaking of ancestral or even of divine promise, akin to the virtual claims to Syria and Iraq by Daesh recruits. A similar virtual setting turned into a moment of compressed real time on 1/6. Now we're speaking of 1/6, not of 9/11, as a claim on the US Capitol was asserted by a mob primed over more than 4 years. Incidentally, the issue of who is or is not native to Palestine, after more than a century of colonization, brings up very interesting issues underlined, I must say, by another article by Raif Zreich, which is not in this particular book, and calls for comparisons with Algeria and expatriate Algerians as well. This is a different matter, but it is really at the center of the preoccupations of this book. Now, moving on a little bit, Moshe Behar brings up the related issue of ethno-nationalism in a contribution that reads almost like an elegy. To the virulence of the drift in Israel political constituency corresponds another stubborn reality, the exhaustion of active, as distinct from vestigially sentimentalist Arab support for the issue of Palestine, memorably described in Leila and Bashir's introduction as a question which has not been answered. and the removal of Palestine as a central plank of Arab political life. The centrality of Palestine is now associated with a remaindered left, way past its shelf life, with the official ideological output of the Syrian Ba'ath, and is above all sucked into the dynamic generated by instruments of Iranian imperial ambitions in the Arab Mashriq. A dynamic deepening and toxifying even further the dissolution of the body national in the region into sectarian formations animated by ancestral fantasies. No wonder the recent establishment of diplomatic relations between Morocco, the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel have led to some noisy but ineffectual reactions. There was not even a hint of humor towards some UAE worthies wishing to play ball with the Behar Jerusalem Football Club. Only Schadenfreude, no humor whatsoever. It's hilarious. Equally sad, Israel may be taken to be a paradigmatic of a polity based on sectarian formations and ancestral fantasies. And Israeli voices have insistently, generation after generation, harped on the so-called artificial character of Arab national states. Remarkably myopic indeed, I must say, as Israel is certainly the most thoroughly artificial state in the region, but nonetheless extremely successful. I would be wary of taking this point of communalism among the Arabs too far, though, as it is habitually done by a cultural trend which refers to itself with no hint of self-irony as post-colonialist. This communalist drift of perspective and of sentiment is also suggested in some paragraphs of Layla and Bashir's introduction, which convey attitudes that in the end act to disarm the victims in the story even further. The fashionable polemic against nation and state conveys the devolution of national rights to communal rights. Let's move on to another stubborn reality, one of the international register, at least in countries normally denominated as Western, in which anti-Semitism, however identified, has been hypertrophied politically. Brian Klug shows in limpid manner and with reference to contemporary Europe how Palestinians are made to pay twice for anti-Semitism. Once for Jews as the stigmatized other, and now for the Jews as the valorized other. Once, as he put it, lower than rats, now haloed, placed on a pedestal, with xenophobia and xenophilia playing at mirror imaging each other. The maximalist vagueness of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is testimony to this. So broad as to defame criticism of Israel and Zionism as a political ideology, and to impede Palestinian claims to equity and to their national rights. It is also legally imprecise and confusing, and therefore almost deliberately designed for political use. The causal connection between the Shoah and the Nakba is rendered here invisible and legally and normatively unthinkable, an extraordinary failure of reason and of moral sense. Now, a common ascription of Semitism and indigenism to both Jews and Arabs in the earlier part of the 19th century is excellently brought out by Ella Shohat in her account of circumstances and implications of the story of Lalla Sulika, the Moroccan Jeanne d'Arc, the whitening of the Jews, as she calls it, the erasure of Arab Jews across the board, and the de-Semitization of Jews undertaken by liberal Jewish intellectuals in the 19th century, the dissolution of the Judeo-Muslim template of historical interpretation. This is all grist to the mill of the post-Cold War historical armature protecting a situation in which Palestinians are disarmed normatively and politically, and maximalist Zionism rewarded and empowered. This armature is the idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition, combining Athens and Jerusalem and leading inevitably to Los Angeles, a motif much beloved of the right in Europe and often vaunted by Netanyahu outside Israel. This notion has become a kind of shared common sense. So much for the power of fantasy over political reality. Now, in this template, Palestinians become mere Muslims generically, and no longer the holders of a nationality, in much the same way that the last 20 or so years have seen a tendency throughout Europe to obliterate the national consistency of Turks, Pakistanis, Arabs, and others, and to lump them together indistinctly as generically Muslim. This, it must be said, is not entirely the work of Europeans. And in this sense, any comparability of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia requires serious nuance. For the fact is that many Muslims, and especially Muslim organizations, have been embarked upon a deliberate course of self-stigmatization, not only with bizarre manners of dress and speech, and with incessant special pleading, but with motifs of exclusivism, externality, and of course, spectacular and indiscriminate violence, all in the name of an ancestralist Islamism directed against all and against Muslims in the first place. This has given tangible and immediate cause for fear. It is a perfect complement to the exclusivist template of an ancestralist Judeo-Christian tradition characterizing Europe. Judeophobia and Islamophobia may be very congruent conceptually, but anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are distinct historical phenomena, incommensurable, in fact, to use a word I generally prefer not to use. One final comment. Emmanuel Levinas, a latecomer patristic figure to post-colonialist airs and homilies, once famously argued contra Sartre's alarm at the idea of the eternal Jew. He sought to reinstate the idea of an eternal Jew in order to restore to the Jews their metaphysical essence, which he claimed was being dissipated by attention to their historical actuality. He sought thereby to emancipate the Jews, so Levinas, from Descartes and Spinoza and from the Enlightenment. This idea was indeed couched in an elevated linguistic register, but what it actually betokens is a very savage notion of identity, which has become another stubborn reality since the end of the Cold War. It feeds directly into the halo Jew of European politicians, with special cloyingness among German politicians and intellectuals. It fits neatly into a perspective of disjunctive communalism, much in favor with the European right. This junction also constitutes the Islamism of Iran, no less than that of the jihadists, both of whom speak of the eternal Muslim, as Orban speaks of the eternal Hungarian, and as Hitler spoke of 1,000 years of eternity. So also is Israel being propounded as a Jewish state, not a state of its citizens, with Jerusalem as its eternal capital. Now, identitarianism is really a template for enclave societies. And in such an enclave society, Palestinians might at best be bit players, a scatter of Muslims, memories of departed Christians, and a large and energetic diaspora. Better not to disparage Arabism too much, not for the greater glory of the Arab nation necessarily, but for the very local reason that the binational state cannot be constituted by elements which are not, or which do not claim to be nations. Cosmopolitanism is quite distinct from communalism and communal diversity. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. We had here two very rich commentators and comments, both of whom tackled upon the various facets that are addressed by the books. But I think that in both in their strengths really put also the emphasis on precisely those questions that arise from raising new questions, right? And continue the conversation. I would say that we first give the floor to Bashir and Leila to respond in whatever way you want first to Alain's 3 questions that were asked a few minutes ago, and if you have any observations or comments to Aziz. Let me again address also the audience. There is, for those of you who are tuned in via Facebook, a comment section, just as we have a comment section on the Zoom. So please leave on either of these chat rooms your question if you have some. Please, Leila and Bashir.
Okay, let me start first of all to thank both Alain and Aziz for their brilliant synopsis and engagement with our book. I find it very humbling and very moving. I also think you gave us an incredible task, which I don't know whether we'll be able to answer, because these were the questions you pose are very important questions, which of course our book tried to launch, but does not in any way pretend to answer. So I take your 3 questions, Alain, and the point that highlighted by Aziz, this issue of Arab nationalism, this challenge that cosmopolitanism is not communalism. And I think that's what our book, I will start with that point. I think that's what our book was trying to do. The book provides a critique of nationalism, but I don't think our aim was to go into or reify any sense of a communalism identity. Our approach, I mean, it's very beautiful that you exactly pointed out that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are not the same, and we never claimed they're the same. What we were trying to do is just show that that you cannot solve the problem of Israel-Palestine, of the Jewish question, of the Arab question, without addressing, one, the inequality. So in other words, in dealing with, as you said, with the stubborn reality, but also sticking and remaining in the stubborn reality will not give us just an answer. So in other words, what we were trying to do was not to forget the stubborn reality. No, we were engaging with the stubborn reality and trying to find new language. And the new language seemed to us from our discussion that it cannot go into a state nationalism, if you want. What we oppose, basically, we say our history showed us, as far as Arab are concerned, that nationalism, as has been said already much before us, from Arendt and beyond, nationalism will lead to exclusionary politics, and Israel epitomizes that in its excellence. Okay, the move to the right is an example of how nationalism cannot but be destructive because it is exclusionary. Okay, and so the question becomes, okay, how do we go beyond that? How do we talk about collective and individual rights? And that has been difficult because we need to confront difficult questions, like one of the questions which was posed in the chat book. Okay, what do we do with the United Arab Emirates opening an Israeli embassy in Abu Dhabi? Right? It comes to that, or do we fall in the trap of those who argue that Iran is more of a threat than Israel, or do we go into, as you said, focusing or pushing for a sectarian understanding of identity, which is much worse, if you want, than a nationalist, but both are bad because they deny the presence of the person and above all the presence of the others and the right of the others. So I think I don't have answers to your question, but I do hope that it was that this exercise, this book, as nicely put by Alain, will be a port of start for everyone who wants to touch this question, is how any ethical and any political answer to the Palestine question, to the Israel-Palestine question, to the Arab question, needs to start with a critical and honest reflection on how nationalism, and particularly state nationalism, is about disempowering, not powering, is about denying a cosmopolitanism, and is about obfuscating connections that needs, or silences, as Alain talked about, that need to be brought up. And that's what we tried to do. So my answer to you, I mean, is to Aziz, is I thank you very much for these very profound intervention. And I hope you're giving us insight to what the next book should be and the issues we need to address. As to Alon's question, I don't want to take much time, I'm cognizant of the time. I will just say that I will answer your third one, because your first one about how do we explain Arab and Jewish right to self-determination in the 21st century. That's exactly what we were trying to tackle. We did not answer it because it's not yet answerable. But what we say is that it cannot be answered through nationalism, through a myopic understanding of nationalism, that it needs to be understood in the larger context of Arabs and Europe and dealing with the other. And it does need to be based on the fact that you need to acknowledge the injustice, but also acknowledge the right of the other as an equal, not as a absolved from the guilt or venerated because he's the victim. That's really what we, so I hope we can, I mean, we have more scope. So I'll let Bashir say more. Thank you very much, both of you.
Okay, so thank you. I want to second my thanks to Alon and Aziz for very insightful interventions. And so let me just frame where I come into this. And I am speaking on my behalf because this is a co-edited volume and it's very limited what the scope of this volume can do. And let alone that this is a collected essays, therefore to come and offer a consistent story, a coherent that covers all these dimensions would be a little bit unfair to attach to this type of project and these types of format. But nevertheless, let me just say where I come to this project and where do I, and in this sense, I want to answer in my intervention without naming Aziz and Alon specifically to both of them where I think some of their interventions do converge in my understanding. I come to this project, and when I initiated this project back at the time at the Kreisky Forum, my purpose was, among other things, is precisely to engage and be inspired heavily by the very dramatic developments and the realities on the ground in Israel-Palestine and in the region. So therefore, I do view this project to be hugely and largely political project. Now, whether there are no implications of the politics of it, meaning what are the concrete types of politics of dynamics and institutional engagements of that form, that is beyond and definitely beyond the capacity of what this project is all about. This is not to detach our responsibility as scholars, intellectuals, whatever we refer to ourselves, to be engaged in real concerns in the fact on the ground. And I know that many of us actually very much engage in the very narrow sense of politics of that, but the whole entire project is extremely political. And I will show two very central dimensions that motivate me in being involved in this. And I will try to do this very briefly. One of the things that I said inspired me starting this project together with Gertrude back in the time is really my very serious concerns about very serious constitutive elements that seem to be at the very foundation and constitutive ways of modern engagements, definitely in the region, but also in Europe. And in that sense, it's somehow also, somehow interrogating two very fundamental constitutive elements of modernity. That is, on the one hand, nationalism, and not nationalism only as such, but specifically the nation state as an enterprise that's seeking homogeneity and driving for purity and sameness. And that assimilationist enterprise of greed of nationalism, which is very much inspired by a very particular form and variant of nationalism, which is ethno-nationalism, in its vulgar interpretations in Europe, but also in its vulgar interpretations of the Republican notion of it, meaning even when you need to detach yourself from the specificities of your ethnic nationalism for the purpose of a Republican notions of French style type of things, seems to be running into serious troubles. And this is the context within which we understand basically the failure of Christian Europe to answer Jewish rights in the context. And this is something that really informed and inspired me by implication to how Zionism actually, in its mainstream at least, or in its main variant, adopted this kind of ethno-vulgar form of nationalism by transporting it into Palestine, but with a very important ingredient. And that ingredient, which is also a very European ingredient, which is basically colonialism and settler colonialism as a variant of it in particular. So therefore, my purpose of at least what I come to this project with is this package of some interest in unpacking, interrogating, and if you wish, even decolonize these discursive constructs that seems to be at the foundation of informing us when we engage with the question of Palestine, with Arab nationalism at large. This is one layer. The second layer is to see the intimate links, not only historically, there might be actually historically some detached links, but conceptually to see how these are also seems to be rather than separate, but intimately interlinked. Now, I am not suggesting that what this book does seem to be exhaustively uncovering all of these intimate links, but actually it's an invitation to say whether there are these links, and if there are links, how we can really constructively engage with them. And the last and final point that I want actually to say in order to give more chance for discussion here is actually to tie this in very sporadic form of, kind of analytically sporadic, but actually conceptually and historically linked, is to interrogate Europe, interrogate Zionism, and partly interrogate also Arab nationalism. And obviously, all of this is inspired, obviously, by the question of Palestine. And in this context that actually, in the intervention comes at a time when actually the question of Palestine was rather reduced, was rather contained, conceptually, historically, to be understood to be as if it is about state, as if it is to be about 1967. What this project seems to be doing, at least from my understanding, is not actually to ignore entirely nationalism, but to problematize nationalism, but also acknowledge and recognize the significance and the powerfulness of the communal structures of coming together for the language of rights. And in that sense, I want to briefly relate to what Ian Lustig seems to be alluding to, which is basically non-national or post-national future for Israel-Palestine. I seem to be very suspicious about, because I have no fascination whatsoever with liberalism, because liberalism seems to be equally lethal and murderous as an enterprise historically in its manifestation, without obviously detaching and without ignoring or denying the much kind of benefits that comes also with the notions of liberalism or certain particular. But this kind of question of trying to disengage, or trying not to disengage, but trying to avoid or escape kind of these stubborn realities that seems to be operational with this kind of communal form of identification is, I think, seems to be very much kind of an escapist form of engaging with the realities of Israel, Palestine, and in the region. And the final thing that I want to say here is that I think we can still operate with these collective communal kind of understandings, which we need to be very careful, and Aziz is absolutely right, with the dangers that seems to be implicated in these types of categories. But actually, what seems to be, what is of a great deal of concern for me, and which I think we can definitely ease in and decrease the danger that are implicated in these categories, is really to try and deal with them in a way where we can really still see the relevance of these categories, but really empty them from certain destructive kind of dimensions. And I want to exemplify this by two things. One is, this whole enterprise would be not understood, at least from my perspective, in the larger context, which alone speaks about alternatives to partition and the Holocaust and the Nakba. And that is precisely that I think, while we engage with these collective communal rights, and I have no worries to speak about nationalism in this sense, what really seems to be at work here is that ascribing and acknowledging forms of collective national rights, one of the most important elements in which this new thinking that we are trying to inject is that this collective national right does not have to be translated into the vulgar interpretations of what I seem to be identifying in the critique of modernity coming from Europe through combinations of colonialism, settler colonialism, basically nation state and Orientalism and different so. And that is, for instance, in the specific case of Israel-Palestine, is to say that actually Jewish exclusive form of sovereignty is non-starter. Because actually precisely of the very existing intertwined histories, existing physical facts, then any notion of a Jewish exclusive sovereignty in the form of a Jewish nation state in the line of vulgar manifestations of colonial impacts of it, is something that actually this whole enterprise of grammar seems to be actually very much questioning. But this is not meaning to give up entirely and to jump into a post-national term of terminology, which seems to be, more alienating if we were to take even the political and the politics seriously in the perspective of how to move forward. And this is tied to the second thing and the last point that I want to make here, which is, again, if this is the critical moment in which we are seeing the vulgar, settler colonial enterprise and Israeli, colonial greed by taking more into kind of Palestine and actually shrinking, kind of suffocating the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. It is actually precisely the point of intervention in which we hear clearly seems to be invoking actually questions that are, to which extent we can see and envision the future of Israel-Palestine in negation and in opposition to existing modalities and existing very powerful platforms that are put forward by the Israeli right and by the Israeli actually center and some the Israeli left, that seems to be actually suggesting this vulgar ethnic notion that is very much premised on Jewish supremacy and Jewish exclusivity and Jewish privileges. What are the counter to that? And I think we are indeed very seriously engaged into this. And I see this conversation as very seriously engaged into looking into how we can really craft the paths through which we can put an alternative that is heavily informed by the very concrete specific realities and by the powers that seem to be informing, shaping, and structuring our understanding of things. And obviously, all of this structure is premised on a very clear way, and this is where the binationalism comes in, which I will be happy to elaborate later in the evening if any of these questions are up, where this kind of process of decolonizations will really unpack any serious things that relate to any form of exclusivity, and where the discussions of Jewish rights become really very valuable from the perspective of the Palestinians as the indigenous people of this land who are trying to craft ways of trying to look about joint and possible Arab-Jewish partnership along the line. And again, this intervention that I made actually has been very influenced and hugely informed by people who have been participants of this group, including Amnon Raz-Karkotskin, Yuda Shinhab, Jilin Najjar, and many others, and obviously Raif, Azar, and many other friends, Amal Jamal and Ilyas Khouri, and many others who seem to be very much not necessarily having the same ideas, but definitely informed heavily by these types of conversations. There are many other things that I would love to relate about the decline of the significance of Palestine as a significance for Arab regimes. And I'm not saying Arab nations, but I think we will leave this at this stage and probably take more questions if people want to ask and move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bashir and Leila, for your responses. You make my life very easy by both of you also following the chat and already answering the two questions that were posed there. I don't know whether you, Leila, would also want to take up the question that Bashir took up that was posed by Ian, namely the question of contemporary nationalist feeling and the non-national future of a one-state reality. But I think Bashir answered this fully fledged already. I don't see questions coming up, which does allow us maybe for the audience to still assemble a few points, but given the wealth of both of the reactions and reflections by Leila and Bashir, maybe Aziz and Alon want to have a very brief response, because you got full ammunition back to you, the questions and ideas that you posed. If you want to have a second go on this, please feel free to come in. You are mute, Aziz, you are muted.
I was suggesting that Alon might like to go first.
I wanted to suggest the same thing, Aziz.
So,
mainly because I want to hear from our audience rather than from us, but please go. give it a go.
And if I may ask you both to keep your responses short and crisp.
I will be. I mean, I will be very brief. And it's quite right. We need really to engage with the wider audience. Thank you very much, Leila and Bashir. I mean, these were spot on. I mean, very comments and responses very much to the point, and most relevant, and really most important, also very open to discussion with others, including critical comment that you have received. So this is really very well appreciated, and I think it's an extremely promising start for a new phase in this common enterprise in which you've been engaged so very, very productively. I would just make 2 points, and I would say them briefly. One has to do with nationalism. There seems to be a kind of cliche about nationalism being at least potentially a monster. It is potentially a monster, but it is potentially also quite a number of other things as well. It is a force. It has often been a force to the good. It has often been a civilizing force, and I use the term very, very deliberately in societies which have required elevation. I don't think really we should forget or completely disregard the issue of underdevelopment, the issue of archaism as we speak in the 21st century. I would simply give an example of a median Palestinian nationalism has not actually been exclusivist. It has not been exclusively rejectionist. It did not have very much affection for the adversary, but it was not internally exclusivist. It was really quite integrative. Median Palestinian nationalism, unlike the other type of Palestinian nationalism, which is represented by the ruling authorities in Gaza. And there have been historically 2 types of nationalism. There has been let us characterize them in terms of political ideas. One we might characterize as positivistic and progressivist, and the other can be characterized as romantic and communalist. There is a vast history for these 2 types of nationalism. Quite a lot can be said about them, but at least I would like us to put on the table the fact that nationalism is not one particular strange creature which threatens to swallow or deform all of us. The other element has to do with the issue of cosmopolitanism and communitarianism. There has been actually quite recently, because of a number of discourses, quite a lot of slippage between the two. And I find that using the word cosmopolitanism in order to project a kind of communalist involution of human groups does not really let me call it. It's a kind of gentrification. It is a gentrification which is not really gentrifiable. These are the 2 main points that I'd like to make at this point.
I'd like to make 2 points as well. One, that I think Laila and Bashir in their answers gave us an excellent way to place the book within the various strands of thoughts and challenges that it seeks to explore. So whether it is colonialism, Europe, exclusive nationalism, etc. So in this sense, it was an excellent elaboration. The second point is about nationalism, and here I follow on Aziz. I don't think that you meant to say, Bashir and Laila, perhaps I'm wrong, but it sounded as if nationalism is indeed, as Aziz just said, a force of evil. I don't think that's what you meant. There are many different ways of nationalism, many different ways. Certainly what you speak about is ethno-nationalism, exclusive nationalism. However we may want to think about Israel-Palestine, why one way of thinking is not necessarily outside of nationalism, but nationalism in a different key or in a different look, within a different look. And the reason I say it is because our world is still divided into nation states. The World Cup in soccer, you can join only as a nation state. The UN is by a nation state. Even one of the greatest authors, the most imaginative authors of the last generation, to my mind, J.K. Rowling, who wrote about a kingdom of wizards, who played Quidditch, the World Soccer of Quidditch, these wizards are divided by nation states. The final is between Bulgaria and France, I think, or Ireland. What I want to say, we may want to think about ways in which the national idea can be harnessed to our critique and to our solutions. As one way, we can also think beyond and below and apart from the national idea, but we may also want to think with it and finding ways to harness it, whatever this it is, to our own aims.
Thank you both very much. I think, as you said, no, our point was not to reject nationalism. What we were doing was to oppose a state-imposed hegemonic understanding of the nation. What we were trying to do is, and this is the connection between, as you rightly said, Aziz, as Palestinian nationalism, if you look at the writings of the 1970s, was totally inclusive and engaged in a very inclusive, thoughtful way. The problem is that we've witnessed is how the nation state, so in the point, the nation state is with us, but rethinking the state is very central to rethinking the nation state. The question we are confronted with, and the Arab Uprising really revealed it, the level of how the nation is usurped by a regime and the understanding of a nation is usurped in order to impose a certain hegemonic, exclusive understanding of the nation, of who is part of the nation and who is to be excluded from the nation. So this pointed out that you cannot rethink nationalism without rethinking the state, rethinking the collective, and rethinking rights. Not in a liberal sense, exactly, because I agree totally with Bashir. We are not invested or committed to a liberal understanding of rights or of statehood. But what is clear is that this model of the nation state that we had, that was very important in the 1950s and 60s, has proved by 2011, if not by 2020, how oppressive, exclusionary, and selective it is. And also how the forces of globalization and the new world we're living in, the connection that we see now between the UAE and Israel, just epitomizes to you how this nation state is both flawed, but still resisting and wanting to keep a certain hegemony or replaying identities that are even more exclusionary. So it's a way to think of the collective in more critical and refusing and exclusionary understanding of rights and of privileges. That's really what we're aiming. So the language is still not, the elements of a new grammar, which Bashir likes to do, we're working on a new grammar of understanding nationalism for the 21st century. Mm-hmm. This one is one that needs to embrace a more rich understanding of Arab history, one which we venerated in the 50s, but completely negated by the 80s. But we need to bring again in ways that is not dictated by oppressive regimes as is going out right now in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Leila. I think, it just becomes very clear that what you have also at the center of your book, right? The question about the nation and the nation state will be with us for a while, whatever perspective we take. And we see this also in the discussions. For the sake of at least taking in one other question, and I think that shall be the last question we're taking from the audience. I have a question, this is addressed to Aziz, but which obviously takes into consideration what has been discussed here, namely, how do you see the relation between the so-called Palestinian as put here, so-called Palestinian nationalism and the Mashraqi Arab nationalism, historically and currently. Of course, knowing my colleague very well, this invites for a fully fledged lecture on how to look at this historically and currently, but I would like to invite you for a brief response to this so that we honor also the questions from the audience and slowly turn this to a close, please.
Right. Thank you very much. The relation between so-called Palestinian nationalism, well, I would be more robust in using the term Palestinian nationalism, and Mashraq Arab nationalism. Well, there are all types of relations. I mean, first of all, historically, they have followed fairly parallel lines in many senses. Parallel lines in that those who elaborated Pan-Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism were a unified group of people. That is to say, the idea was that the one did not actually negate the other. The one did not necessarily negate the other. The negation of local nationalism by Pan-Arabism was a body of political moves by the Iraqi and the Syrian Ba'ath. Otherwise, it really did not quite have much purchase, because generally the two registers were played simultaneously by all Syrian, Iraqi patriots, even those who called for Arab unity. The two were played in effect in parallel lines, and the one did not really necessarily have primacy over the other. So in the foundational cadre, in the median generation, that is to say the generation of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and perhaps into the 60s. And then, of course, the flourishing of this type of nationalism, both Palestinian and Arab, in the 1960s and 70s before the great reversal. And the interesting thing there is that what did distinguish Palestinian nationalism from other types of nationalism is the fact of Israel, is that particular situation which had confronted the Palestinians. And as such, this is one reason why Arab nationalism and local nationalisms, be it in Syria or in Iraq or elsewhere, had actually had a Palestinian platform as a main plank of policy. Now, to what degree this was sincere, insincere, at what points in time, when and by whom, that's a different matter. This is a matter of a history of events. But it did combine all of these elements together, because you did have sincere engagement, you had insincere engagement, you had opportunistic engagement, you had the whole lot. The package is really quite complex, but the package is actually one whole package, in fact, because the two were really quite fully integrated until of course, the last 20 years, in which the incidence and the centrality of the question of Palestine lost its centrality and was diverted to very particular types of Islamist nationalism in the region. We have no way of telling how much purchase this pro-Palestinian stance has still among the Arab public at large. I don't think we have any way of telling. None of the polls don't tell us very much, or don't tell us very accurately, but my suspicion is that this particular issue has actually receded together with the recession of engagement with public matters in the Arab world at large.
Thank you very much. I see Bashir, you want to come in, please, as editor.
Yeah, very briefly, but just
absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, very briefly in reply to Alon and the soccer and the football and nation state get invited to. I mean, first of all, we need to be very critical. about not romanticizing nation state. And I'm not making the claim here that alone is romanticizing the nation state. I'm just saying that this transition from the imperial order to the national order is really worth and deserves very serious critique and very serious engagement, given the fact that this enterprise that is called the nation state and the national order has led to so many ethnic cleansings and genocides of different types, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to bear that in mind. And one of the purposes of engaging with that leads me to the second point. And the second point that I am of a great concern that is seen, that from my perspective, underlying this project that we are at here is that most of those countries who seem to be invited to the soccer, to the Mondial, to play soccer or many other forms of sports or many other occasions, cultural or political, the overwhelming majority of them are either binational or most overwhelmingly are actually multinational. And the question here is how we work with categories such as, or with concepts that seems to be extremely important and so fundamental, but we need really to unpack and decolonize them. One of them is sovereignty. This is why when we speak about sovereignty or Jewish sovereignty, we need to talk about form of Jewish sovereignty that is absolutely not exclusivist and surely not translated and not cashed out in an exclusive Jewish state. So this is one thing. Self-determination is another one, cannot be equated necessarily with statehood, and definitely not statehood to mean to be understood and cashed out as an ethno-vulgar form of nationalism that is homogenizing. Again, back to the concept of the critique of modernity about understanding nationalism to be homogenizing enterprise. Now, all of this put together leads me also to be very critical and to be much more wide perspective when we come also about other forms of competing nationalism, such as civic nationalism, if we bear in mind the French. The French are not less problematic in their understanding of nationalism than the vulgar Central European form of nationalism, but in a different way. So again, what really makes here, I don't have a problem that the states would go to play soccer, but I have very serious problem about what is the makeup of this state, what is its sovereignty, what is institutional, constitutional making. And this is precisely the point in relation to Israel-Palestine. The last point that I want to say about Israel, about Palestinian nationalism, Layla and Aziz are absolutely right. I think early on Palestinian nationalism, without now historicizing too much, really kicked off at certain point, definitely post-Nakba time, but also before the Nakba, as being actually territorial inclusive form of nationalism, actually in which the Jew, certain particular Jews were called actually Palestinians. This is why the Palestinian National Charter includes a definition of that. Now, the interesting story is that actually paradoxically, and unfortunately, Palestinian nationalism in the past 40 years has been influenced paradoxically by Zionism as a vulgar form of nationalism. And this is not the issue of only Gaza. Gaza, this is more, I think Aziz meant Hamas, but not only Hamas and the Jihad and the Tahrir, but also the national, supposedly secular variant of Palestinian nationalism has run into very serious trouble of vulgarity in the form where Palestine territorially was reduced to be very serious, very insignificant chunk of the country, but also Palestinian nationalism, uncoupled itself and departed and dislocated the Jew as a potential Palestinian. Now the challenge is, and I'm not only reducing that only to the Jews, by the way, it also has very serious ramifications inside Palestinian politics. The challenge of today, and this is why it's really informed and inspired by the specificities of the concrete local politics that we have in the land, which is a colonial intertwined reality of apartheid form of segregationist politics that is premised on Jewish supremacy and Jewish privilege. And to exit from that is precisely where Palestinian nationalism is facing a very critical challenge in which it expand the scope of historic Palestine to be including the river and the sea and all the territory. And then the question how the Jews have become now internal to Palestinian nationalism, which basically exert very serious pressure on the ways how you envision the future and the rights of these within this not only the right, but also the institutional frame. And this goes to what Ian was suggesting about one state, two state, confederate, which all of that. Now, the line that seemed to be at least advocated and advanced from my perspective, and I think also Layla in somehow, but also in the joint work that I did with Amos, seemed to be suggesting that the ethics of binationalism, not the solution of binational state, but the ethics of binationalism inspired here by Nono, Amnon Raz, and many others who have been advocating this, seem to be at work here in a way much more promising path of politicizing and conceptualizing Israel-Palestine than other competing norms.
Nadia, can I say a word?
Yes, please say a word.
It's a word, because I cannot agree with Bashir more, of course. I agree with everything he said about the nation states, nationalism, etc. What I was trying to say is that we think within a certain historical imagination. Also, by nationalism, think within a certain imagination of something called the national. Only we see it as more humane, as not exclusivist, as binary. So I certainly agree with you. I don't think there was the pointing out that we tried to find out a more humane way for people to live together within a certain structure that history imposes on us. We don't have a history now that can be without a state, without state sovereignty, that is part of the international system, etc. So I have now, by nationalism is the solution for what we say, which is in itself part of this historical imagination. What is this historical imagination? It has many different ways and forms. Some can be of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and some can be humanly possible living together. But we cannot live outside of the imagination of our historical period. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Very much. Leila, you want to have also, I give you the last word as the co-editor, if you want to have a brief response also to this, and then I will have to turn it to a close.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with Bashir, and I can only say to Alon, yes, we are, conditioned by the historical context we are in, but don't forget, men make their own, and women make their own history, not under conditions of their own choosing. And if this book is trying to do is show how we can make a different history within the conditions we are in. And we do think also that we are at a juncture, in that we are in the 21st century, we're no longer in the 20th century. We are at a juncture which forces on us and is asking from us, especially after 10 years of the Arab Uprising, to think of our context in order to make it a little bit different. But thank you very much, both of you.
Yes, thank you indeed. I mean, first of all, of course, both of you who put all the work into this wonderful book, a book that really has prompted in such a discussion, which is extremely rich, and it is extremely rich, let me please say this at the end, because it is driven by your intellectual rigor, the rigor of the contributors and you as the editors, but also because there is something you have at stake, right? I mean, it is really, I think this is what also brings out the passion in the discussion. As much as it is needed to think along, to maybe have the imagination or to be more confined along the feasibility of what are the constraints of our reality in which we live, but to think along these lines and to propose and to open up views of how one may think things differently without falling, and I think your discussion brought this out so importantly and well, romanticizing stages past, dreaming of something of reconstitution and all of these terms that did not fall and that were not mentioned for very good reasons, has been illuminating, has been enriching. I take it that the audience was engaged and listening carefully to that discussion and to that debate of the panelists. I really want to thank again both Aziz and Alon for their thoughtful and provocative interventions. And last but not least, I would like to thank again the Kreisky Forum for making this possible. And I think, Gertrude, you saw very clearly that this is not the closing of a project, but has been now the opening of a new one that will want to follow up based on what has been established here. So thank you also very, very much for providing that space and freedom. And what better places than the Kreisky Forum. I wish you all a peaceful, a good evening, a good day to the US, wherever you are, Jerusalem, the East Coast, where the audience comes from, various places. I've learned we are followed by Facebook and by Zoom. We close it here and say goodbye from Vienna. And I can tell those of you who didn't get enough of the book, there will be other book launches with other discussants. So follow the trail of the book and you get more of this. Thank you very much. Good night.